Hi, Jeremy Engelman here, and welcome to Introduction to 3D Studio Max. Now, when you first start 3D Studio Max, you can see this. You get 3D Studio Max, obviously, and if you haven't already dismissed this welcome screen, you'll get this welcome screen. This welcome screen contains some useful stuff, user interface overviews, and some really quick little tutorials about how to do various things. I assume you were interested in something a little more in depth, otherwise you wouldn't be listening to me. But it does contain something useful here, which is access the area. And the area is written like a crate, I guess, so suggest it's super top secret or something. So you click on that. Oh, Internet Explorer. Anyway, you go to the internet, and so if you can just type area.autodesk.com into any browser, but it's a great resource for tutorials, great resource for other textures, images that other people have done you can get inspired by. But you also have this incredible forum, which if you are having trouble with any aspect of it, you can go into there, post a question, and invariably somebody will get back to you with some help and their experience and whatnot. And then when you get really good, you can go in and help other people out as well and laugh at their newbiness. But so you go to, but there's also downloads. Like I said, textures, there's shaders, plugins, all kinds of great stuff that you can download from here, service packs for the software, that kind of thing. But it's not really super secret. They'll let anybody in, so I myself logged in as 3D God at AOL.com. And so if you ever want to chat, get on there. Maybe I'll get back to you. At any rate, so that's the area. And as I said, great resource for tons of stuff. We close that, and you can choose to not show this dialog at startup, which you probably want to do pretty immediately. Close that. But if you ever forget area.autodesk.com, you can always go back to help and hit welcome screen. It'll come back up again. You can click it that way. Now when you get into 3D Studio Max here, into the interface of it, you see there's tons of stuff, right? Tons of buttons everywhere, but it can be broken down into several main components. You have a menu bar, which you're probably pretty familiar with from other applications. You have a toolbar, which again, commonly used tools. Most of them are contained in here or here. Just button interface to commonly used menu items. You have down here, you have a timeline and a bunch of other boxes for entering certain types of things, a bunch of buttons. We'll get to all of these. The two main ones I want to focus on right now are one, the command panel, and two, these viewports. Now, the viewports are incredibly important because we're creating 3D stuff, so each one of these represents a view into your 3D scene, a view from the top, the front, and the left. Those are orthographic views, which means that they just project straight down with no perspective, straight down or straight front or straight to one side of your scene, and then you have perspective. And then next to that, you have this command panel. This command panel has several different tabs pertaining to different types of things you can do. You can create, you can modify, you can work with hierarchies, you can do work with motions, display, and utilities. And we'll get to we'll use those as we need them. For now, we're going to concentrate on creating things. This is one of the best parts about 3D Studio Max, is just how easy it is to get in and immediately start creating stuff. Okay, so within the Create tab, you have a bunch of different classes of things. You have geometry, you have shapes, you have lights, you have cameras, you have helpers, you have space warps and systems, and tons of different things. And even within each class of things that you can create, there's a drop-down menu here which allows you to further refine that class of stuff. So there's classes within classes, so different types of geometry that you can create, and then each one of those has different types within it. So there's hundreds of things that you can immediately create in 3D Studio, and it's incredibly easy to do so. All you do is you click on one of the buttons. We'll click on a teapot, standard 3D primitive, right? There's a whole history of it, but we'll get into that later maybe. And then to create anything, you go out to the viewport and you click and drag. Now, different types of objects have a different number of parameters that you want to initially set. So if I create a teapot, I just click and drag, okay, and then that creates a teapot of a certain size, however long I've drug for. If I create a box, I click and drag to set the length, and then I drag again, I click again, then drag to set the height of the box. And if I go back to teapot, I can click and create a bunch of other little teapots. So if this is common in 3D Studio, if you click on a button someplace, and there's several places you can click on these buttons, and it remains yellow, it means it is an active tool, which means you can just create bunches of them immediately. All right, and then if you want to abandon that tool, you can right click and cancel out of it. And another great thing about it is if I'm drawing something, let's say I'm drawing this huge teapot, and oh yeah, I don't really want that teapot at all. If you right click, it will abandon that current creation, still leave you in that tool mode, so you can right click again and then exit that tool mode completely. So that's neat. I've just created a bunch of stuff, but now I want to be able to see it, right? So I can see it mostly in my ortho views, but in my perspective view, I'm not able to see everything. Now, that means we need to be able to manipulate those views. So this is something that you're going to do. It's the thing that you're going to do the most, is manipulating views. And so there's some hotkeys for it, and there's also some buttons for it. I'm going to tell you the hotkeys first, because that's what you're going to do 95% of the time at least, is use your hotkeys and your mouse buttons to manipulate views. And the central one to 3D Studio is the middle mouse button. So if you have you probably do have a middle mouse button, even if you don't think you do, because if you have a mouse with a rolly ball on it, if you click it, if you push on it and hold it down, that rolly ball or rolly wheel, that acts as a middle click. And when you middle click with your mouse in one of the views, it acts as a pan. So you see it turns to a little hand and allows you to pan the view around. Works in perspective as well, so you can get a good idea of what's going on. Well, you still can't see everything, so we need to be able to zoom out, in or out. And that's where you roll the wheel. If you roll the wheel, you can zoom in or out of any view. Okay. Now, 3D Studio has this notion of an active viewport. So even if I roll in and out and I'm kind of over here, sometimes I need to be able to make that view active. Sometimes you sort of forget and you're like, oh, zoom this one in or out, but it's actually zooming that one. In order to make a view active, right click in it. One quick right click, tongue twister, and then you can pan that view. All right. Now, with things like a perspective view, a common thing that you want to be able to do is rotate around that perspective view and see what you've got. So that's when you hold down Alt and you click the middle mouse button. That allows you to rotate your view around either the scene or a certain point. Okay. So zoom in or out, rotate around, and pan back and forth and up and down. Now, sometimes those camera controls aren't quite enough. You need a few additional ones. That's where down here in the lower right hand corner you have all these controls which pertain to the view. So you see that when I'm zooming in or out with the middle mouse button, wheeling in or out, it depends on your mouse I guess, but it's pretty, it's not a very granular, it's not a very fine-grained zoom. So that's where you can come down here and you can use the little zoom tool to go in or out. And that gives you a little bit more control over where you're going with it. Right below that, you see there's a rectangle zoom, and rectangle zoom allows you to draw a box in which you can zoom in very specifically to something, to some part. Okay. Next to that, you have a hand. I almost never use this hand because it's the exact same hand as we had before, just by clicking the middle mouse button. So very rarely use this hand, if ever. Right above that, you have this button, which is Zoom All. And what Zoom All does is similar to drag a box zoom, but it allows you to drag in any one of the views and it'll zoom all the views all at one time. Right next to that, you have a button which is Zoom Extents. What that does is zoom to the entire scene in the currently selected view. So if I right click here, make it active, and then hit that Zoom Extents button, it will zoom to everything that's in the scene. Now, that Zoom Extents button has a little tiny black triangle in the corner of it, which means that it's a flyout, which means that if I hold it down, it'll operate, it will give me access to related, to similar, but slightly different tools. So right now, if I'm in Zoom Extents, if I hit this one, that's zoom to selected in the current view. So there's Zoom Extents and Zoom Selected. So what that does is gives me whatever I have picked, it will in the current view zoom to that. right next to it is related. These tools behave very similarly, but instead of doing it to just a selected view, they do it to all views. So if I click on this, it's going to zoom extents in all 4 of my viewports. And if I zoom to selected, zoom extents all selected is what the entire name of that tool. It's a wordy way of saying it zooms in every viewport to what I have picked. And right below that, you have a little button that's the maximize viewport toggle. What that means is it just is going to make whatever view you've got picked bigger. So it's going to take up the entire viewport. So it's just maximizing that view and then restoring it back to the 4, the quad view. Next to that, you have this arc rotate. Remember, we talked about arc rotate when we hold down Alt and middle mouse button. That's a quick shortcut for arc rotating. And so you can invoke the tool, and what you get is a little manipulator here. And so you can click anywhere on the inside of it and rotate around. It'll also allow you to, if you pick on these little, top and side boxes, it'll allow you to constrain your rotation to one direction or another. And actually, you can do that with the middle mouse technique. If you hold down Alt and then also hold down Shift and you push the middle mouse button down and drag in one particular direction, you can see the cursor changes to a sort of a constrained mode. And so you can constrain it to one view or another with the hotkeys as well. But you still might use this button because this button, as you see, has a flyout. So it's got 3 different modes of operation. Right now I'm in the selected mode, which means that it's going to rotate around whatever I have picked. So if I go in and pick something else and now rotate, it's going to rotate around that new thing that I've got picked. And that works even if you're not in the tool mode here. You don't have that tool picked. It works with the hotkey as well. So whatever I have picked, it's going to rotate the view around. Okay. Now, and that's where you may use this button because it has arc rotate around the scene, which just means that it's going to rotate around rather the camera's center. So you rotate around the camera's center that way. Or as I said, selected, which is, I like to use it with selected. But it also has one other mode, which is arc rotate, or the yellow one, which is arc rotate around selected, which, or excuse me, around sub-object, which means we're going to talk about sub-objects later. And 3D Studio it's kind of a subtle convention. When it's gray, it means it applies to the scene. So even like here, you have a gray one and a white one, and in here you have a gray one and a white one. That pertains to scene or camera or whatever, and that white pertains to whatever a whole object that you have selected, and yellow usually means do something to or rotate around or whatever a sub-object selection. Now, sub-object selection is something that we're going to talk about quite a bit because it is an incredibly powerful way of modifying objects. But for now, let's worry about selecting whole things. Now, you saw me hit this little arrow button. That's the first thing we'll talk about in our toolbar, is this select tool. So you come up here, and now with that little arrow, you can select things. So I can select this one, that one, that one. I can select the mama teapot or the babies or whatever. Now you can see I can select something, or I can click and drag a box to select something. If I want to subtract from that selection, I can hold down Alt and click, or Alt and drag and subtract. If I want to add to the selection, I can hold down Control and add one by one, or Control and drag a box and add. So there's all these different ways to pick things. If I want to deselect something, I just click outside where there is nothing and it will pick nothing. You can also go to the menu and you have select all, select none, select invert. Potentially, I rarely use those. Invert sometimes. Select none I almost never use because it's just far easier to click outside of the box or outside of any other object. But what you can also see is now I'm dragging a rectangle, but you can also change the way you select multiple things. So right here you can see this rectangle has a little flyout, so we're going to open that up. There's quite a few options for that. There's rectangle like we just had. There's also circle, so you can select by a circle. I very rarely use that, to be honest. But there is also fence, which is very handy if you want to pick just like these three, baby teapots, right? You select by fence. There's also select by lasso. This is a normal lasso like you'd have in Photoshop, where you can drag a freeform lasso, whereas fence is, constrains it to straight lines. And then you have paint. Paint selection is really handy. So once I click on somewhere in the scene, I get a little, paintbrush looking icon, and I can paint a selection of stuff. Now there's another modification to the way you pick things, which is this little button here. And you can see when I drag a box around something, like let's say I wanted to pick these 4 baby teapots, and I click and drag, you can see the rectangle that I'm drawing is intersecting the mama teapot too, so it's going to select that as well. So when I drag, if it's touching even just 1 pixel of the wireframe, it's going to pick that thing. And sometimes that can be obnoxious because there's if you have a dense field of objects, it can be really hard to pick things that way. So that's when you can go ahead and change this mode. You can see it's called window crossing. I like to think of it as touching or engulfing. What it means is you can see the little icon when you have a little object here of some kind, and your marching ants selection is just touching it, then it's going to pick it if it just touches it. But if you click it, it changes to a little object that's totally engulfed by marching ants. So what we'll do is when we, if we want to pick these 3 baby teapots here, we might accidentally hit the mama, but since we have engulf mode on, the only things that are going to be picked are things that we have actively engulfed with our selection. So if I want to pick all of these, all of this business in here, I can just drag a box around it, pick it, and hit delete if I want to get rid of everything. Well, you can also, I didn't really want to do that. Obviously, 3D Studio, like most software, has an undo, and it has a multiple levels of undo. So if I pick things and delete individual things, I have multiple levels of undo and also redo. So undo and redo map to, and it'll tell you what you've done up here. So undo, redo, Control Z and Control Y. But you also have toolbar buttons for undo and redo. The handy thing about that is that the toolbar buttons, if you right click it, will give you a list of what you've done. Sometimes it's not very specific, let's say, but select, delete, select, delete, select, delete. It doesn't say what necessarily, but still kind of handy to get sort of words describing what you're about to undo or redo. And then the cool thing about these, if you right click the buttons here, is that you can pick multiple things to either undo or redo. So you can pick all of these things or up to here and redo just that section of stuff that you've undone or redone. But if I want to get rid of everything and start from scratch, you can go to File, New. And File, New, it seems, we can ask you if you want to save your changes, say no. File New seems sort of self-explanatory, but in 3D Studio it operates a little bit different actually. When you create a new scene, you can actually keep objects in hierarchy, or just your objects, or just new everything. And so the difference between those is that if you keep your objects in hierarchy, essentially you just get rid of any animation. And then if you keep your objects, you get rid of any hierarchy and the animation. And then if you new all, will get rid of everything that you've got completely. And that's the way I generally work, is new all. I very rarely use those other options. And what you will notice is if you click new all, it keeps your your perspective views and your orthographic views as they were. So if they were all kind of wonky, new doesn't really help you here. That's where 3D Studio has this kind of weird command that is called reset. And what reset does is it resets 3D Studio as if you had restarted it from scratch, as if you had exited out of it and then relaunched it. And so to be honest, I more often than not use file reset as opposed to file new. So let's look at creating some more stuff here. So as I said, you have this create panel, and this is the way I create things most of the time, but you also see a menu item for create. That's kind of a shortcut to the create panel plus a type of thing plus then another type of thing. So right here, if you're creating, this first section of the menu is corresponds to create geometry. So create geometry, standard, primitives, extended, AEC, objects, compound, all these things. You'll see if you drop down into here, this these menu items match these little rollouts here. So can be a quicker way to get to some of that stuff. I started using 3D Studio before they had a create menu. You created everything through here, so I still tend to create it through this panel. Although sometimes it is a heck of a lot quicker to go just navigate the menu structure this way as opposed to go to here, go to here, go to here, go to there, and then hit a button. So you can get through it with fewer clicks sometimes. However, that being said, I still oftentimes use this method. So let's create a few things. If we create some standard primitives here, let's start out with that. Let's create a sphere. All right. Now you can see that before you start creating something, you can set a few things. Creation method, you can have keyboard numeric entry here to create it, and then a sphere itself has all these different parameters pertaining to its being a sphere. It has a radius, it has a certain number of segments, and it has some options here. Now, we definitely won't be able to get through all the options of everything, but before you create something, it's a good idea to look through and see what you've got. If I just draw a sphere, it's going to draw from the center out. Well, I mean, that's fine, but maybe I want to put a sphere on the floor. Well, there's a great option for that. Base to pivot will draw a sphere, but it will use the bottom of the sphere as sort of the point at which it is drawn from and grows from, so it'll automatically appear on the floor or a table or wherever you want to put it. So sometimes it's handier to do that. And then when I draw a sphere, okay, so I'll draw that. And now I have a number of segments that I can choose, and what that refers to is how many divisions that sphere has. And you see most objects have something similar, the idea of segments, which means 3D Studio, each object, if it's a round sphere, is actually made up of polygons. And those polygons, if we right-click on my perspective view here, or the name perspective view, I get some options for this view. A handy option is this thing called edged faces. You can switch a view to wireframe. These ones default to wireframe, so perspective defaults to smooth plus highlights, which means that it's nice and shaded in here. But you can change it. There's several different ways that you can display something. The common ones to use are smooth plus highlights, wireframe, or smooth plus highlights, and then this thing called edged faces, which is kind of a combination of both of them. So when I zoom into that sphere a whole lot, I can see that this seemingly round sphere is actually made up of flat planes or polygons. 3D Studio has a couple of different geometry types. It's best at polys, and so we'll get into some of the differences between geometry types, but most of the time when you're creating geometry in 3D Studio, it is polygons. It is like this. So it is even round stuff is actually made up of little flat planes. So if I was getting really near to this sphere, all of a sudden the edges of it are going to show up. So I want to increase the number of segments and make that thing seem rounder. Okay, so as I increase the number of segments of that thing, I increase the number of polygons it is made out of, and so I make it divide more between them, and it's going to be rounder, less planes. If I go way down to as low as you can go here, I get a really rough sphere. Hey, you can already get a sense of what's so awesome about 3D Studio is that any changes I make in this panel here, while my sphere tool and the sphere I've just created is active, it allows me to modify that thing really fast and really easily. So I can create it to be a hemisphere, and so it just sort of sinks back into the ground from whence it came, and I've created a hemisphere that way. You can also turn a thing called slice on, and you can create a little orange or whatever you want to make. So you can turn that off, and it's a whole sphere. Base to pivot, all of these options update the sphere live, and you can see what they do. So this is one reason why 3D Studio is so awesome, is that it allows you to quickly see what it is you're doing and that the changes you make. It's one thing that's so great about it. All right, but I'm not going to have time to go through every single parameter of, as I say, every single thing. So let me show you keyboard entry here. This is another way to create something. You can create a sphere with a radius of something, and you can position it in world space at some coordinate. This is something that we need to talk about. The idea of coordinate space in 3D. 3D has three axes, 3D, three dimensions, right? So you have X, you have Y, and you have Z. So using those three coordinates, you can specify an exact point for anything, whether it's the center of something or a specific point of something, where it is, whatever. So you have X and Y and Z, and they correspond to R, G, and B. And so X, Y, Z. Sometimes you don't get the labels on there, and so but you know if it's red, it's X. If it's green, it's Y. If it's blue, it's Z. X, Y, Z, R, G, B. All right. So if you ever get lost or you don't exactly know what view something is, every view has a little compass here. It's called a compass, and it'll tell you exactly what direction is what. And so that's positive Z, that's positive X, that's positive Y, and anything this direction of it, opposite where those lines go, is a negative. So using that coordinate system, you can specify anything. So if I want a sphere to show up at 5 in Y and have a radius of 5 here, I can set those numbers ahead of time and hit create, and then it'll show up at 5 in Y and 5 radius. Now you see that the grid here doesn't, each grid line in this case doesn't correspond to 1. It's actually subdivided. We're going to talk about the grid in a little bit. But each one of these grids is actually 10 units, and so that's why it came out a little bit smaller than we sort of expected. So with any object, if you know exactly where you want it and how big you want it numerically, you have this keyboard entry rollout. And these rollouts, you see rollouts everywhere in 3D Studio. You see them in materials, you see them on the create panel, all sorts of places. You can collapse them or expand them. If it's a plus sign, it indicates that it's able to be expanded. If it's a minus sign, it means it is already expanded. So if you click it, it'll expand it. Click it again, it'll collapse it. So I can collapse any of this stuff and kind of clean up my command panel here, or expand it all. And if I expand it all, it might drop down below my visible view. Some of these things get really long. If that's true, you see this is kind of gray, and then this is black, indicating, well, there's more stuff down there. I can click on this little thing to scroll around and see the rest there. Or I have a little hand. Wherever I have sort of a dead area here, wherever there's no box or no button, it'll turn to a hand, and I can drag the little hand up or down and scroll through this thing that way. Also works on the toolbar here, incidentally. So since I'm recording this video, I have to have kind of a lower resolution than I would ordinarily work with, and so I'm missing a couple of things off the side of my toolbar here. But if I click in the dead area of this toolbar, and there's not a lot of dead area, it's kind of sometimes hard to get the little hand, but okay, there we go, get the hand, and you can scroll the toolbar back and forth. I'm kind of really missing the combo box here and one little button. So at any rate, if you have 3D Studio's large toolbar buttons enabled, your toolbar buttons might be a little bit bigger than these. You might have to scroll around as well, and that's in the preferences, and we'll talk about those in a while. So anyway, you can scroll this around with the little hand. You can also collapse these, and you can actually reorder them as well if you want to. So if you want keyboard entry at the very top, you can swing those around and reorder them just by clicking and dragging on them. And that's true, again, in the materials editor or any other editor that has these rollouts. So if I create some more primitives, I'll zoom in here, I can create a box, which, as I said, some of these have multiple clicks that you need to make. So if I go over here and into the perspective, drag a box, I click and drag to set the width and height, up again to drag up again and click to set the height, the width and length before, and then set the height. I create a cylinder, very similar, but click, drag, set the radius, drag to set the height, and then click to finish it. Same thing, so torus. So there's so many different kinds of objects that you can make with 3D Studio. You just keep going. Teapot, right? We already made some of those. And you'll also see that when I'm creating these things, I generally like to create either in the perspective view or in the top view. It's because if I create in a front view or left view, like if I were to create a teapot right here, the teapot will sit on its side. So it uses whichever view you've got active as sort of where its bottom is sitting. And so again, sometimes you do want to create a torus in that view, but more often than not, I create things in the top and perspective view. Perspective view behaves similar to top in that it uses this as the ground plane. So if you don't want things skewed off to their side, you can create in one of those two views. A cone, and so you can just keep going on and on. These are just the standard primitives anyway. Plane, right? So many different kinds of things you can create immediately. Now, and every one of them has a slightly different parameters. These are all what are called parametric objects, which means they are made up of a certain set of parameters, and so you can change those whenever you want. So if I go back to creating a teapot, and as I'm on that teapot, I can change the radius, even if I don't like what I've drawn. I can just, I want it to be a little bit bigger. I didn't draw it quite right. I can change the radius. Teapot's a little chunky right here, so I can change the segments and make it smoother. And then, being a parametric teapot, I can choose to have the handle, or not a lid, or not a spout if I want. So all of these parametric objects can be created and are built from parameters, and those parameters can be changed at any time. All right, keep going, and you can create tons of other different types of things. So if you go down here, you get extended primitives, and you can create things like chamfer boxes, which is just like a box, but then when I on the last click, I click to set a radius of a thing called a fillet on the side of the box, which actually creates much more natural looking geometry than just a perfectly solid edged box. There are really no things in the real world that have perfect, crisp edges like that. So chamfer primitives, and I use these chamfer primitives all the time, are far more natural. And so you have a chamfer cylinder. You can create that, move that up, and then on the last click, you set the number, or the radius of the fillet. And it's very small there. So if I accidentally created it too small, I can just use one of these spinners. These are called spinners. They're just up and down arrows, but the reason they're called spinners in 3D Studio Max, or the cool thing that you can do with them, instead of clicking a bunch of times or setting a numeric value, I can click anywhere on one of these spinners and drag up or down to change that value very quickly. So it's really handy in 3D Studio, and you can even drag all the way off screen if you want, and it'll wrap around and keep changing that value for you. So these spinners are a really great way of adjusting stuff. So same thing, height, radius, anything, you can spin it, and it makes it a lot faster to change these values. Same thing with height segments, sides, which is a common one to change with the cylinder. 12 just usually isn't enough, gets real chunky, so you want to change the number of sides all the way up, higher, and also then the fillet segments. So fillet segments will give you a smoother result along the side, along the little radius there. And keep going here. You can create capsules, right? So let's do that again. There we go. Create a capsule. You can create hose, right? That's pretty cool. So you can create all of this relatively complex geometry with just a few clicks, right? And it gets even better because you can come down here. We'll talk about compound in a little bit, but you can create particle systems really easily. So if you come down here and just click and create some snow, right? You click and drag the size of it, and then as you move it up, you can make it snow. Okay, so you create particle systems very easily. You come down here and create, you can create even doors. So let's create a bifold door. So I'm going to click, drag, set the height of it, and actually that sets I always forget which way it's going. So then if you forget, that's again the great part is you come down here and change the depth. I accidentally made it way too deep, so I come down here and change the depth, and now you have a bunch of options that you can go through. You can make it double doors, you can flip the swing of it, but then you have a cool little parametric option, which is I can open them just a little bit. So this is super cool that you can create things this easily in 3D Studio and modify them this easily in 3D Studio. All right, so you come down here and you can create, similar to doors, you can create windows. So if I come down and create a an awning type of window and go like so, and again I made it a little too thick, so I want to change the depth of that, and you can do change the number of rails and panels in there, so like so, and then how open that awning are. Still a little bit too deep, so not a problem. I can always go in and change that. Now, if you've accidentally clicked outside and like I did, just started to create another awning type of window, right? You can't go back here and change the modifications, because if I'm in the create panel, these parameters here will only let me change the thing that I'm about to create or the thing I'm currently creating. I've already clicked off of this window here, and so that is something that's been created. Well, you might think you're done for, but you're not, because all you have to do is you have to go to this next panel over, the Modify panel. You click on the Modify panel, and that gives you access to all of the parameters that that thing has got. So if I want to change the depth again back, if I made it too thick, I can just do like so, or change the amount of openness, then I can do that as well. But once you created it and clicked away from it, you have to make those changes now in the Modify panel. Okay, so again, you just explore through here, and the number of things that you can create. 3D Studio even allows you to create different types of foliage, right? And so click, and I can create a palm tree just that easy, right? It's incredible. And then if I go back to the Modify panel, I can change the height of my palm tree and do all this kind of stuff. And there's no way I could go through all the possible parameters of this. The best way is to just explore. So the amount of primitives that 3D Studio ships with that you can just create using just a couple of clicks is truly stunning, really. Create all these extended type of primitives, weird shapes and stuff, handy shapes, stuff you can use before, architectural shapes, doors, different types of doors with different opennesses, windows. You can actually create all kinds of foliage, trees, just with a couple of clicks, and it's incredibly easy. More architectural primitives and stuff. So it really is amazing the sheer amount of primitives that 3D Studio ships with that are so easy to create immediately. And once you get a bunch of objects made, you'll see that well, your scene can get pretty heavy, and you can make really complex scenes with just those primitives. Virtually everything in here is made up of just a primitive, like we've been talking about. So you can see that when you have a bunch of things in here in the wireframe, 3D Studio is about the most colorful 3D application out there, because what happens is, let's create a new primitive, or create another spiral staircase. I happen to like these spiral staircases, so I'm going to make that spiral staircase like so, and then you can see that when you make new objects, what it does is it gives those new objects a color, and it's based on this here, this color chip next to the name. You can change this at any time, this object color. You can change it to whatever you want it to be, and until you assign a material to this thing, it will render this color. When you end up assigning a material to this thing, it will no longer, this color has nothing to do with anything. It's just the color in this view, which is the wireframe view. And these wireframes are one of the most basic ways to visualize objects in a 3D application. It draws them just the edges, the polygons, and the points. But that can be, it can get a little bit confusing to look at things in this way. And it's definitely not the prettiest. Now, another thing that I love about 3D Studio Max is it's awesome at displaying a shaded, textured view. So actually, a lot of these objects that I've got in here are already textured. So if I just go over and I click Smooth plus Highlights, I'm displaying some of the textures that I've made in here. Now in 3D Studio, you can draw an object wherever you want it, and so you could work entirely in that way, but likely you're not going to. The next most basic thing to 3D applications after drawing and creating the geometry like this is moving it around. Moving rotating, and scaling it. These are called transformations, and those are the most basic things that you can do to an object once you have it made. And so here next to your select, various types of select stuff, you have these very basic transformations and a couple of buttons and combo boxes here that apply to them. So one of the most basic ones is obviously move. So I'm going to click the move button here, and you can see it's called select and move. That means if I'm in that mode, I can pick something as well. I don't actually have to go back to pick it, and then move. And all of these toolbar buttons are that way. Select and move, select and rotate, and select and scale. So if I want to select and move this spiral staircase, I can just pick it and start moving it around. Before we start moving it, what you need to be aware of is this little thing called a manipulator. And this manipulator is what allows me to move it around. And that manipulator is where any of these operations are going to take place from, but also allows me to move them in certain ways. Like you see as I mouse around over this, it turns yellow in various ways. It turns yellow if I hover over this little blue axis. That's a Z axis, and so it corresponds to Z here. Y, X, same, Y and X corresponding to those. So I can move it just in one direction or another, Z, Y, X. But I can also move it in two directions at once by clicking on one of these three little planes. So I can click and move in X and Z at the same time, or I can click and move in Y and Z at the same time, or in the case of the spiral staircase, what becomes really handy to be able to do is to move it in X and Y at the same time. So I hold over that plane, and then I can move it along this natural ground plane that we have. So I could move it into place over here or wherever I wanted it. Now 3D Studio also allows you to right click on any one of these buttons, and you can type in your transformation. This is what's called a non-modal dialog box, which simply means that I can still do other stuff in 3D Studio while this dialog box is open. Now, a lot of windows and dialogs are non-modal, just meaning that I can continue to work while these dialogs are open. Some are modal, meaning that you have to type in your input or accept a command or whatever before you can actually go back out and do things in 3D Studio. So I could leave this move transform type in someplace that I want to work in it and just continue to work, move it around this way, and you'll see it'll update here. It also updates down here. Your coordinates also show up down here as well. So there's several different ways and places that you can move or rotate or scale something. Again, graphically here, in the type in, so if I knew I wanted it to be 1 foot up in the air, I could type that in and it would go up 1 foot in Z. That's that direction up in the air. Now these spinners also work, so as I click on these I can spin it around as well. Spin it up and down and it'll update to reflect what I've done. And then another handy thing in 3D Studio, if you right click on any spinner, it will set it back down to its default or lowest value, which is commonly 0. Now down here, again, similar numbers, so a lot of times I don't end up using this move transform type in because when you're in a mode here, you can do the same thing right here, okay, by typing in a number or clicking on the spinners and moving it around, reset by right-clicking the spinners. So you can do that right from here. So I often don't use those. However, this section here also has this switch, which switches these numbers from absolute mode to relative mode, which means that in absolute mode, if I set this number to 1, it's going to move 1 foot up in the air. If I set this number now to 2, it's going to move to 2. If I set it back to 1, it'll move back down to 1. That means it is in world coordinate space, and so this number reflects whatever 1 foot up in the air all the way through the world. Okay. If I change this, click this button, change it to relative. What that means is if I type 1 up, 1 in Z, it will move it up by 1 foot in Z, and here you can see it resets back to 0. So that means I can type in another 1 foot in Z, and it's going to move it up another foot in Z. So I can go 1 by 1 by 1, and I can just keep moving it up by 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot, one at a time. Okay, that's relative. It's relative to where it currently starts out. Doesn't really care where it already is. If I type 1 in any one of these directions, or 2 or 4 or 10, it'll move it 10 feet in any one of those directions. So I can go back out to absolute, and now you see I'm at 3 in absolute world coordinates. So if I want it back down to 0 or on the ground plane, I can right click here and it's back down to 0 and on the ground. Another thing you're likely to want to do is rotate this thing. So if I go over here and hit rotate, now I can get a different kind of manipulator. This is the rotate manipulator, and now it's a little little trackball, virtual trackball. And you have those same axes, and so you keep your eye on the view compass down here. You'll see Z, that would be going around Z, that would be going around X. So red goes around X, green goes around Y. And so you have X, Y, and Z, so I can rotate it around Z. That's a likely rotation I'd do on the spiral staircase. I can also rotate it around X, though. Not a very likely rotation unless it fell over. Or Y here. All right, so, and then you can just undo if you don't like any of those. Now you can also rotate it in multiple axes at once. If you click anywhere not on one of the little constrained lines, you can just get a free rotation. You rotate in all those directions all at once. All right, and then you can also have there's also a circle encompassing everything. If you click on that circle, and it'll turn yellow, indicating that that's the thing you're currently picking. If you click on that circle, you're rotating around in screen space, so around whatever imaginary axis that my eyes are making with respect to this thing. So as I look down through it, now I'm rotating it around that line that my eyes are making, looking at this thing. And I can also come in and scale it. So I move over to the Select and Scale tab, and you can see it's called Select and Uniform Scale. And you notice that Scale has a little black triangle there, which is called a flyout. So it has a couple of different modes as well. We'll talk about those in just one second, because actually one of these has kind of become redundant, but we'll talk about the other one in a sec. Let's talk about basic scale here first. Select and Uniform Scale. You see this manipulator here. And this allows me to change the size of this thing in various ways. And similar to the other transform types, it turns yellow wherever you're in whatever operation you're about to do on it. So as I mouse over different parts of this little manipulator or this little gizmo, various things turn yellow. The most basic way to use scale is if you click on the very middle of it, and that's going to scale the entire thing up or down uniformly in every single direction. So grow, shrink, right? Now, if I click on various components of that manipulator, I can scale it in different ways. So you see, just like the others, you have Y, X, Z. So if I scale in Z, it's going to grow it in just one direction. And same with X and Y. So you can non-uniform scale those, meaning you're proportionally scaling them in one direction or another. And then you can also, again, similar to the move transform tool, you can scale in 2 dimensions at once. So whenever you click on one of these regions just outside the uniform scale, just outside all 3 axes, you can constrain it to 2. So now I'm going to scale it in Z and X all at once. A handy one for this one might be to scale it in X and Y all at once, but not Z. So it's going to kind of thicken it out, but not make it any taller. Now if you go to the flyout and enable some of these other things, you see there's a select and uniform scale. There's also a select and non-uniform scale, which is in 3D Studio a long time ago. You used to have to pick that because there was no manipulator like this. Manipulator technology didn't come on the scene till a little later, but so you would have, if you wanted to scale it in one direction or another, you would have had to pick the axis individually and select this button separately. But now you can get to all that functionality that's in this little tool with the select and uniform scale. However, there's this other one here, which is called select and squash. And so what select and squash allows you to do is, as you scale in one direction or another, it will kind of squish out the other directions as well. So it's kind of a little squash operation. It keeps the volume roughly the same. So as I scale it up in Z, it makes X and Y more and more narrow. So if I go back to the select and uniform scale, you'll be in that 90% of the time at least. Come over to here, and these three tools are so common for you to use that they're mapped to hotkeys already. The hotkeys for them are W for the transform, select and move, for the move transform, E for rotate, and R for scale. So W, E, and R. And so from now on, I'll just switch between those modes with W, E, and R. Related to, and so conveniently next to, your various transform types, you have this combo box, which allows you to select your so-called reference coordinate system. This allows you to move, scale, or rotate in different ways. It defaults to view. View meaning that you're going to be doing any one of those transformations according to whatever view you're in, relative to whatever view you're in at the time. Now, perspective view, you can look at your view compass right down here, and this will give you a sense of, this will give you the world view. So you see Z is up, positive X is this way, positive Y is that way. It's actually not quite the same in a view coordinate system here. Positive Y is that way. If I hit Alt W, now when I'm in view mode, when I'm in view reference coordinate system mode, you can see that this compass down here, that compass is in world space. But you'll see my little, let's change this to the move tool so that we can get a good sense of what Z, Y, and X are. You can see right here Z is up, Y is that way, and X is that way. And that's relative to the perspective view, and also, incidentally, relative to the top view. When you're using view, it means that Z is always facing directly into your view. And so here, if I'm in a left view, even though world space Z is up, according to view coordinate system, Z moves straight back. Z is a depth into my scene. And so this will change around. You can see as I change to these different orthographic views, Z always stays going straight back into whatever view I'm looking at. But I can change that. If I come down to this combo box and I make it world, that means that manipulator that I have for moving will stay solid no matter what. You can see no matter what view I take, what view I change to, the manipulator is never changing. And in this mode, world mode, it means Z is always up and Y is always in one direction and X is in the other direction. And it will always match this little view compass here. And so world mode might be a little more intuitive to work in. But anyway, now there's these other types of modes. We won't go over all of these, but there's view, there's screen, there's world, there's parent. So let's talk about screen here. Screen mode means that whatever orientation I make this camera, Y and X are going to be up and down and right and left, and Z is going to be straight in. And that means that I can take this manipulator and move it around on a plane that is perpendicular to my view. And you can also see in the other views that my compass has changed to reflect that. So you see now it's all kind of off kilter. This just means that along Z, that is my angle of view. So my camera is out here someplace looking this way along Z. Now we come up here and let's talk about local. That's the last one I'm going to talk about is local. If you change it to local here, that means that now the transformation manipulator always corresponds to this object's local X, Y, and Z axes. Not only does the world have an X, Y, and Z, but the object itself has its own internal coordinate system, which is X, Y, and Z. And it may have nothing to do with the world itself. So if I take this view up a little bit, and no matter what I tumble this view around to, the object's local coordinate system stays rock solid. And again, bears not necessarily any resemblance to the world coordinate system. So if I move this object around in X and Y, it moves this way. Around, up or down in Z, it moves that way. When that gets really good is when you do rotations. And so as I rotate this object on its axis, now you see that the different transforms will actually, this mode that you're in, the reference coordinate system that you're currently in, will remember. So if I change to rotate, it's going to snap back to view. If I change back to move, it's going to snap back to local because that's the last one I left it in. So this box remembers what you last left it in per transform. So if I change rotate to local, it's going to switch again just a little, ever so slightly, and that's going to allow me to rotate this object around its own local axis. So let's get it real off kilter here, and we'll see why that's beneficial. If I were rotating in view, now all of a sudden I'm rotating this thing around the view coordinate system where z is up. But if I change it to local, now I can rotate this thing around its own local axis. That can be really hard to do in view. Now this also gets good in move mode. So if I've rotated that object all around, let's say if I rotate this and I rotate it so it's just just pointing that way, and then I want to move it, I can move this object. Now again, moving in view can be a little bit tricky to get it positioned exactly right. But if I move it in local coordinates, now I can move it till it intersects the ground, and then I can also move it up a ways. So I'm moving it along its own local z-axis. So if I want to scale this thing up so it hits the top of the roof there, scaling it up this way isn't going to do it because that's scaling it along view, or even scaling it along world wouldn't help either because that's just scaling it up with the world axis in mind. So it scales it in all these funny ways, these funny dimensions. But if I change this to local, now all of a sudden I can scale this no matter how I've rotated it or moved it around. Z is always up, and I can scale it in that one single direction, which makes perfect sense for an object like this. So I can further kind of rotate and position it until it's just hitting the side of the building there, and move it around. And now when I move it, moving it along the ground here can get really tough because see how it's sort of burying itself into the ground because I'm moving along its local coordinate space. Now's when I can switch over to either view or world space, and now when I move it around, it'll always stay planted to the ground, but its rotation remains the same. Now if I get it into place, and now I also maybe want to rotate it in world view at this point too. Rotate goes back to local. That's the original one I had it in. But if I like the angle and I just want to rotate it back into place so that it's retouching this thing, again, now local becomes a coordinate system that doesn't really help me. Now rotating it in world coordinate system makes more sense because now I can rotate it just along this relative to the world. Now, as many different types of objects as there are in 3D Studio, and there's tons, at some point you're going to want to change those objects up a little bit or modify them. And there are so many different ways to modify something in 3D Studio Max. There's a ridiculous number. Well, the first way is that you can come over here to the Modify panel so we can get a better look at it. I'm going to move it up towards us here. And I'm going to apply what's called a modifier. So here in the Modify panel, not only can you change these, but you can apply new modifiers on top of this thing. And this is where 3D Studio just gets ridiculous with the amount of stuff that you can do. If I take this thing, I have a thing called Modifier List. I open that up, and this list is so big that it even goes way off your screen. It goes all the way to the bottom of my screen. And so the amount of modifications that you can make to an object that exists are just, it's insane. And if you look at the sheer amount of these things, it's easy to get overwhelmed. There's so many. But the great thing about 3D Studio is it uses this thing called a stack, which means you can edit these things non-destructively. So you come in here, and let's say some of these are more kind of utilitarian and more about editing the mesh, and some don't really won't make a lot of sense right now. We'll get to a bunch of these in a little bit, but a lot of these are just a blast to kind of play with. So you come down here and you have one called taper. And taper, now when I add a taper to the spiral stair, you see that there's my initial object, my spiral stair, that's as it was created. And then you have taper on top of that. This is called the stack. So if I taper this thing by some amount, let's taper it. I'm going to taper the very tippy top and make it a real pointy spiral stair. I've tapered it by some amount. The taper itself has all of these different parameters, so I can make it curved taper, curved in one way or the other. I can also change the axis of the taper, so primary and affect which axes, so I can get all kinds of different results with it. And just by clicking the buttons, I get a live preview of what's going to happen. This is where 3D Studio gets, again, to be a blast and extremely powerful, actually, because you can make changes to something that you do, and whoa, that's not right at all. You just come in and change it back, or you can choose to limit it to a certain size. Like I'm only tapering up till here, and so you just play around with these, and it'll never. You just feel very comfortable knowing that it won't actually ever really truly destroy anything, because you say, oh yeah, I don't like that. Just turn back off limit, and then go back to what you'd had before. And the really powerful thing about this modifier stack is that even though I've tapered this staircase, you say, well, I like what I've tapered it to here, but I need more stairs, or they're too thick here. I can always go back to the original parameters of the spiral staircase and change them here. So if I change the number of stairs, I can change it right there, and the height, how high it goes, or the depth of the thickness of the stairs right here, I make them thinner. I can always go back and my taper is still active. And you can see you can make these changes, and it even makes the changes and with the taper applied to it. So this is an incredibly intuitive and powerful way to work. Now modifiers, this is called a modifier stack after all, can be, you might venture a guess, they can be stacked. So if I take some other object here, already got a couple of modifiers on it, and if it's already got some on it, I can go in and add another one. So let's add a bend to it. I'm going to add a bend modifier and choose an amount to bend that thing. So I can bend that, make the little bag run around or whatever I want to do. So bend. And modifiers, each individual modifier you see has a light bulb next to it and has a plus sign next to it. The plus sign, if I click on it, expand that, it has a couple of what we'd call sub-objects. It has a thing called a gizmo, and that just means, and yes, that's 3D Studio's word for it. Even the transform, rotate, and scale things, these are called gizmos, but I more often call them manipulators. Doesn't sound quite so goofy. But anyway, no, it's really, that's 3D Studio's terminology for it. It's gizmo. And a center. The gizmo is the sort of kind of I guess it's a container, and that container kind of gives you a preview or a sense of what this operation is going to do. So this kind of like takes the bounding box of this object, and within that it bends it according to this shape. So you get a preview of what it's kind of going to look like or supposed to look like. But it also has this other one, center. And when you take the center, you can expand bend or any other modifier, and very often have a center or an axis or something like that. If you take the center of it, you can transform the center around in the gizmo, and you can affect where the bend is beginning from. So if the bend begins at the top, that's different than if the bend begins at the bottom, and then I can change the bend again. Now he's bending from the bottom and sort of doing a little dance around. And if I take the gizmo and then, let's say, rotate the gizmo around, now I can get him to bend forwards or backwards, do back bends, forward bends, and change the angle again. So I back and forward now. So not only can you add these modifiers and stack these modifiers, but you can change the parameters of the modifiers, but you can also then change the sub-objects, or sort of the centers and how they're being applied to the thing. And so, the sheer amount of stuff that you can do with these things is pretty incredible. And so now I've bent him, so I can go in and do something else. I can come in and do I could do a taper on him as well, and taper it in just a little bit and make this little, butt fatter or something like that. And change the curve of it. So you can use modifiers to model and make changes to your geometry. And you can see they just get stacked up. So there's one thing on top of another thing on top of another thing. And now those things can be disabled or enabled at any time. There's this light bulb next to it that allows me to show or hide the effects of any one of these modifiers. So if I turn the light bulb off on taper, let's make that a little bit more extreme so we can see it. Turn the light bulb off, and it will turn off the taper. Turn off the bend, keeps the taper, anything above it, but just turns off the bend. So I get to layer these things up. If I turn back on noise, which is something that I had deactivated, a little noise modifier. Now, again, the really cool part about this, I can go back through any level of this stack and make changes to the noise and change that around if I want to the bend, and then everything on top of it will update accordingly. And some of these things are just a blast. I mean, there's no way I'm going to go through every single one of these, look through the documentation, but most importantly, just look through the modifier list here and look in, see what else. Oh, melt, that seems like a blast. So let's pick melt and just, you see the parameters here. Oh yeah, look at that. Melt, give it an amount, so I can melt the bag there. For some reason it's kind of going into the ground, so I can melt the bag, and I can give it different melt properties. Does it melt like glass? Does it melt like jelly? Does it melt like plastic? What's the way in which this thing would melt? Probably plastic. I don't know if that's gonna do it better or not. But then melt has its own sub-objects that you can change around, and you can change the center around which it melts and the axis along which it's melting. And it looks like what I did here was to melt it before I tapered it. So the stack is something that if I click on something, the modifier is going to go in immediately above whatever I had picked. So if I take melt and now I'll say, well, I didn't really want it there, I can rearrange it. I can put the melt after the taper just by clicking it, dragging it, and dropping it. Now the melt is going to occur after the taper. So that's giving me a little bit more like what I would expect from the melt. So it's going to the stack can be rearranged at any time. Or if I wanted to bend it after I melted it, I just take the bend and put it up there, bend it after the melt occurs. So I can also even go in and take any one of these things, click this and go in and melt that. I can melt everything in here if I really want to. So melt, right? Come back and even melt my staircase. Melt. Melt that staircase. So if you say, well, that was stupid, I melt the staircase, you can always get rid of them. So again, no change that you're making with modifiers is ever destructive until you do a thing called collapse the stack, which we'll look at in a sec. But if I take melt and say, well, that was stupid, I can always just deactivate it, or I can just take it and delete it entirely. This little button here is delete the modifier, and then I can get back to what I had. So same thing with this. If well, that was dumb too. Why did I do that? I can pick that thing and the modifier is still there. Just delete it and it's back to where it was. There's a few other buttons underneath the stack. And so you have this one here. This is show end result. What that means is kind of like what I've been talking about. If I come down here to bend and I change how I've done the bend, it's showing me not only the everything underneath bend, but also whatever's on top of bend, so taper and melt as well. If I turn that off, it's just going to show me how I'm bending it. So that can be a useful way to say, well, I bent it this much, and now what happens when I taper it, and now what happens when I melt it. So you can choose to either show it or not show it, depending on kind of. Sometimes it can be hard to visualize what your bend is doing while you have all that other junk on top of it. And then you have this other one here, which you can configure modifier sets and use these sets. So it's a little bit hard. It kind of goes off screen there. If I move my 3D Studio over a little bit, you'll be able to see it. So see the menu here. You can configure them. You can show buttons. That will just give you a list of buttons here that you can show. So if you have frequently used modifiers, you can you can make your own little sets here. You can use their sets, so mesh editing, and you can have any number of buttons there that you want. Just like I said, frequently used buttons that you're using for a certain application, like patch or spline editing, mesh editing, animating when you're doing your UVs or your mapping coordinates. So you can come in here and you can also configure modifier sets. So increase the number of buttons, because even though there's an empty spot here, you have to give it an explicit number, so 22 buttons. And you can come in here and you can say, well, let's add melt to that. And so we'll take that, drag it, drop it there, and we'll say my stack, modifier stack or whatever. Hit save and OK, and then it'll automatically switch to that one, and it'll show up in here right there as a saved modifier set that you can come back to all the time for, again, certain tasks that you might do over and over. Now once I've made a bunch of modifications to this object, if I like where it is, at some point I can choose to collapse the stack. What that means is going to take all of these modifiers and collapse them down into one thing called an editable mesh. Now, There's a lot of reasons that you would do this. It's kind of like flattening layers in Photoshop. Sometimes if you want to take an object and export it out and bring it into another scene, you don't want this whole stack, this whole history involved. You don't need it. It's not doing anything for you. You can go ahead and collapse that. There's nothing really wrong with leaving all of these modifiers intact. That's fine to do. 3D Studio it doesn't really cause any necessarily any overhead with it. So if you ever want to go back to an earlier version, it's kind of nice to have the stack intact like this. However, if you want to collapse it again, for if you want to export the object to something, if you just know you don't need this stuff, it's a good practice to get into. There can also be cases where you can have modifiers that may not be standard stock default 3D Studio modifiers. Like you can download modifier plugins that do even a whole new range of modification to your objects, and occasionally it won't be supported, that modifier that you've downloaded from Joe Schmo who wrote it and posted on the internet. And if you want to share that between people, then they may not have that plugin. Any of these modifiers that you have intact here depend on a plugin, and sometimes you can get errors if you're trying to share, or even if you move versions of 3D Studio. If you upgrade a version of 3D Studio, that modifier might not work in the new version, and then you would want to have a flat copy of it. So what you can do if you want to collapse the stack is you just right click in the modifier stack and you say collapse all. You can also collapse to. So again, it's kind of like Photoshop if you're familiar with it. You can collapse to a certain point, collapse up to this bend. Let's say if I collapse up to this noise, I can collapse to here. And now it's going to ask me a question, and it'll say this will remove a portion of the stack, and it's going to affect its parameters. Now I won't have access to the parameters underneath here anymore, and so any animation applied to those modifiers will be lost. And what you can do is you say yes or no. It's just going to remind you. You can choose to show this message or not. But then there's this other button called hold yes, and I'm actually going to click this button. I'm going to show you a thing in a second here called hold and fetch with 3D Studio. So I'm going to say hold and yes. And then it's it's flattened everything up to that point, but left me everything above that point. Now, what I've done is I may or may not like the result of that. Either it could give me errors, or maybe, oh, I really did want that to happen. I can always undo it, and that's the easiest way to do it. But 3D Studio also has, if I go to Edit and Redo, it also has this thing called hold and fetch. So if I go under the edit menu, you have your normal undo and redo, but then you also have this thing called hold and fetch, and what that does is if you hit hold, it holds that in memory. And then you can choose at any point. I can do a bunch of other things to it, say move this thing around and do things and delete stuff out of the stack or whatever. And then if I go back to fetch, it'll say about to fetch, and you can see what it does is it brings me back to that state of this exact state at which the scene was left in when I hit the hold operation. And so it can be a kind of another way to ensure that that before you do a potentially destructive operation, or before, say, I really like my scene at a certain point, let me try something, see if it works. Well, if it doesn't really work out how you planned, you can just hit go back to fetch and go back to a previous sort of state of your scene. So use hold fetch just in case you are about to try something and you may not like it. Now there's also, if you pick another object here, there's also, if you right click, you can collapse all. And what that does, again, ask me the dialog box, are you sure I want to continue? Yes. What that does is it collapses this thing into what's called an editable mesh, which just means that it's forgotten all of the parameters that it began with. And so this one began as a cylinder, and so it has all of these different. I can change the number of sides at any time I want to. I can change the radius height at any time I want to. If I collapse the stack, collapse all, it's going to change it to just a thing called editable mesh, and now I can no longer make changes to the height, the number of sides, and all that stuff without doing it a slightly more complicated way. And so those things, those original objects, are called parametric objects, and then there's a distinction between those and editable mesh. Editable mesh is simply a collection. I'm going to zoom in on this thing here. Simply a collection of faces and of polygons, faces, edges, vertices, that sort of thing. And now I have no way of easily, anyway, going back and changing the number of sides of that original parametric cylinder. And knowing when you want to do that or when you can and can get away with it, you'll get through experience. Again, there's really not a lot of overhead in keeping a stack unless it gets incredibly huge. At some point you may want to collapse it. All right, so let's move on to duplicating objects. Now, under the Tools menu here, there's a bunch of different ways of duplicating objects. Mirrors, arrays, spacing tools. We're actually going to go over a few of those. Not all in intro, but a few. But under Edit, there's a thing called Clone. And that's the most basic way of duplicating an object, is just to clone it. And you have some options when you clone an object. You can clone it as a copy, an instance, or a reference. And there's a subtle difference between instance and reference. A copy is just a pure copy. So if I hit copy and hit OK, now I have a copy of that object. Okay, and I can hit delete to get rid of that. Now, a slightly easier way to clone, and the way that I do it most of the time, is if I'm in a move, rotate, or scale mode, I can actually, by holding down Shift and drag, immediately make a copy of that object. And then when you do that, you can make a certain number of copies that way. So it can be an easy way to make a number of immediately transformed copies of an object. Okay, so if I take this, hold down Shift, drag, let go, one copy, that's fine. Now, if I make this thing a copy, each one of these things is completely independent of the other one. So I hit OK. If I tapered this thing, it's completely independent of that the original. So that's a copy. Now, if I take this and Shift drag and make it an instance, OK. Now, when I add that same taper operation, now you can see there's a little gizmo drawn around both of these things. So when I taper one, the other one tapers as well. They're an instance. They are, for all intents and purposes, the same object. They can just have, it's just a literal clone of it. It can have a completely different transform. So I can move it around. I can even actually scale it and rotate it completely independently of the original. But any operations that I do here in the stack or to the original mesh of it are going to get propagated to the instance. Okay, so if I take that, and let's say I don't like that taper, or actually let's leave the taper on. Now I'm going to make a new copy of it. So I'm going to Shift drag, and let's say, now this time I'm going to make it an instance, and click OK. Or excuse me, a reference, and click OK. Now, this referenced object is going to share all of the parameters of the original, so it has the taper mesh on there. But the referenced object, now I can add new modifiers to it without influencing the original one. So if I come down and add a melt modifier to it, and then I melt this object, the original one doesn't melt. However, if I change the taper in either one, the taper is going to affect both of them. So a reference just allows you to have all of the original modifiers, but add new modifiers on top of that don't get propagated back to the original object. Now, modifiers can also be copy and pasted between objects. So if I have this spiral staircase with a taper with specific settings that I worked out that I really like, I can take that taper and copy that taper, and I can pick some new object and paste it. I can paste it in one of two ways. I can just paste it normally, and it's going to paste that entire modifier on there as it was with the spiral staircase. So even the size of the gizmo and the center and everything like that. So you can see it's quite a huge taper there. Okay, so I can paste that on there as it was originally, or by deleting that modifier, I can paste it as instanced. Now, what's going to happen is whatever changes I make to either the new modifier or the original modifier of that taper are going to get propagated to every single instance of the modifier. So it can get a little bit confusing. You can have instances of things, but then also individual instances of modifiers. And you know it's an instance because the modifier is italicized here. So if the modifier is italicized, it means an instance. Plus, when I pick it, you'll see something else, some other gizmo highlight in the scene. But if you can't see it, you'll know it's an instance by if it's italicized. Now you can remove instances either by right-clicking and you say Make Unique, or there's a little button here that does the same thing. Right here, this button will make it unique. So it'll take that modifier, and now it's not italicized. So now if I make changes to that original modifier, the other one is not updating and reflecting that. All right, so I'll get rid of that. Now this gets really useful when you have a whole lot of geometry that needs to be duplicated. But you don't want to just straight clone it because or make just a copy of it, because if I were to make a copy of it, any changes that maybe it's all similar geometry and it's supposed to be similar. So if I change one, I want all of the others to change in the case of this. So in the case here, all of these are actually instances of each other. And so I can tell that because it's the bottom of the stack here is bold. If the stack is bold-faced, it means it is an instance of something else. And it doesn't really matter which one of these I pick to make the changes to it. Everything will update accordingly. So if I take here, I made all of these little tiles here with just a tube and with slice on, and so it's sliced in a particular way. If I wanted those slices to go a little bit further, a little bit less, then I can change the original parameters of it, and you can see all of them are changing. Well, I don't really want that. Let's say one really common thing would be is if I created, if I wanted slightly more or less number of sides. If I had too few sides, these might start to get chunky. See how they would be a little bit too chunky. So I might need to increase the resolution of them in order for them to seem smooth. And you notice that they all are updating. So if I increase the resolution of them, but I had 18 sides, and that might be a little bit too much. It's just as important having enough sides as being aware of trying to not have too many sides as it is to have enough. Because if I have too many sides, now all of a sudden I have a lot more triangles, more polygons that I have to render, and my render time isn't going to be quite so good. So maybe if I just eyeball this, I could actually take this down to 8 sides and they'd be okay. But what's great is that I'm updating all of them all at one time, and I'll be able to get a much more efficient render in this way with just one little operation. Now each one of those is an instance of each other, but if I grab the transform gizmo here and hold shift and drag a new version of it down, I can call this one a reference of that original ones. And what this will allow me to do is take this and add something like a noise modifier on top of this. And then I can take that noise modifier, make some changes to it, give it some strength in X, Y, and Z. Noise modifier is incredibly useful. Take the scale down, and what I can do is I can warble this a little bit, add a little bit of noise to it so it's not quite so perfect, right? And it's not going to be affecting all those other ones. So like maybe I just make a few of these that are kind of jacked up, and I want to intersperse those throughout, and so I don't want to, but I don't want to affect all of them. Not all of them are going to be, have a bunch of noise on them. But then if I took this and duplicated that, then each one of these, whatever noise I did to it, the other one would get the exact same noise, and so they might again start to look a little too similar. So what I could do is pick all of these and add a noise modifier to all of them. You can add modifiers to more than one thing at one time as well. So if I want to pick these, I could go in and start picking one, hold down control, pick all of these things. But there's however many there are, 30 some odd, 40, whatever. It might take a little while to do that. Now 3D Studio provides this select by name dialog box, which is incredibly handy, and this is where that naming convention for you is really going to pay off. So if I pick one, I can see I named them well, so I named them terracotta tile 1 through 31 or whatever. So if I go under select by name, this new dialog is going to pop up, and I can just start typing a name. And it's going to show me everything that contains that name, or pick for me everything that contains that name. So I can click OK, and I've got them all picked. All right, and then I can go in and add a noise modifier to all of them, and you can see that noise modifier now is one huge modifier, so that if I add noise to it, let's add noise in Z and take the scale of it way down, you can see it's adding noise to all of them as a whole. And so it's a nice kind of little way to break the monotony of of a whole bunch of pieces. And if you pick one of them, you see that what it is it becomes an instanced modifier. So the noise is italicized, meaning that it's instanced, kind of like I did before with the little cylinder. So when I change the noise on any one of these, it'll change the noise that affects all of them. Now, if any time I had a selection, a more complex selection like I just had a second ago, which started out with all the terracotta tiles, I clicked OK. If I wanted to get all of them selected again very quickly for any reason, that's pretty quick. But what I can also do is I can come up here to this named selection sets box and just type in a name. And now when I have a name selection set, if I click on the little combo box here, I can click on it and it will automatically select all of those tiles. So I can create any number of name selection sets and then come in here to the name selection set editor at any time. And you see here's the sets, there's the members of that set. So if I wanted to get rid of it, I could delete it, add to it, subtract from it. So selection sets is a powerful way to quickly pick complex selections in your scene. Now 3D Studio is ultimately an animation program, and so we want to come in here and do some animation. Now there's all kinds of ways to do extraordinary animation in 3D Studio. Some of it can get very complex and tricky, but the easiest way is by animating modifiers. So we come over here and we see all kinds of controls pertaining to animation. You have a time slider, so if you have animation already in there, you'll get you can scrub back and forth between your animation. And you have what's called a mini track view. This will show you frame numbers, also where you have keys on an object. Keyframes being, well, the object is here at frame 0 and over there at frame 100, so you can get an object to move around. Then you have a couple of key buttons here, auto key, set key, and then a big set key button. And then some transport controls here, so you can play back an animation, and some time configuration options. All right. For intro, let's try to keep it simple. And as I said, one of the easiest ways to animate something is to animate its modifiers. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to go into this thing called auto key mode. So I'm going to take this bag and I'm going to go to my modifier panel. And I have some modifiers here. I have melt. So I have an amount. I'm going to take that, and then I can move my frame slider, my time slider, a little ways out. And then I can add a key. So just by changing this value with auto key on, it's going to add a key for me. So I'm going to say, well, at frame 296, I want this thing to be melted completely. And you can see this the spinner changes to red to show that there's a keyframe in place, and you get a couple of keys here on your miniature track editor. So I come in and turn off auto key. Now when I scrub backwards through it, you see I've got some animation, and I can come down here to my transport control and play back that animation, and you can see that thing is melting over time. But there's also here another type of modifier animation, and that is on this little strip of water. The strip of water is just a box with some fractal noise, with some noise applied to it, a noise modifier applied. And I didn't even animate this noise. It comes with a parameter in it called animation. If you just check it, it will animate that noise. And so you can see that noise is sort of making the water, wiggle and warp around in there, and I didn't even do anything. Then you can adjust the parameters of that animated noise. And in fact, you can even adjust the parameters of the animated noise while it's playing back, and you can see what it's doing. But it's pretty cool that you can actually make changes to things as it's animating. In fact, you can even change the camera as it's animating and in the viewport here and watch it back. Now, there are scores of other ways for you to animate in 3D Studio. In fact, 3D Studio even allows you to create very simply. If you go over to the systems thing, you can create a thing called a biped. And what that allows you to do is to, let me restore this perspective view here. It allows you to create a little humanoid figure right out of the box, and you can apply motions to it that also ship with 3D Studio. And so there's all these pre-made motions that you can make, and so you can have your little figure kind of get up and twinkle toes across the scene there. But we need to start out with some of the more basic types of animation, and that begins with transform animation. And so again, like we did with the modifier animation, we can go back to auto key here, and if I have something picked, if I just move out to where I want that key, you can see he's got some little modifier animation on him right there. And so he's sort of wiggling and squirming around. But if I with auto key on any of these transforms that we talked about, I just come out to the frame and put him where I want him in that frame. And then I can come out to another frame and move him just a little bit more, and even rotate. Rotates work, scales work. Any of these transforms on an object work. And with auto key on, whatever you do to that thing will automatically be keyed to it at that frame. So I come out to another frame and say move them off screen at that frame, and then when I go back through, it's already animating those changes that I made. Just sort of stick with auto key. Now there's another way to do it, and you can use this set key. So if I change modes to set key, again my frame turns red here, indicating that that I'm about to animate. But with set key, you have to explicitly be at the frame and change something. So if I come out here and then change his position over to here at this frame, then I have to click this key button in order for it to accept the key. And you can see here in the mini track editor here that those keys show up. So two ways to generate keyframes for animation: auto key and set key. And if I don't like the positions of those frames, or where the keys show up, this thing is called a mini track editor, which allows you to actually do some edits to those keys. So I can take each one of these keys that show up in here, pick it and move it. So if I wanted to extend the animation a little bit or something, I can extend it and spread out the frames using this mini track editor. And I can also take those keys and delete them. So we can delete all the keys off of that thing, and now it's got no more animation on it. And then if I want to hook up a different style of animation to it, I can take this bag here and I go to animation. The animation menu contains all sorts of commands relating to, obviously, animation. And you can go down here to position controllers and to path constraint. And that'll open up this motion menu, or tab in the command panel. And that allows me to assign a controller to its position, rotation, and scale. And if I assign a path constraint to it, it's going to draw a little line and allow me to pick a path that I want that thing to be on. Now that thing is going to snap to this path. I've already created this motion path in here. It's just a normal curve of any kind. And then it will show up on that path and animate along it. It'll automatically put keys for your path at 0 and whatever your end frame range is. So it's assuming that you want the motion of that thing to extend over the entire frame range. If I want to change that, I can just pick it in the track editor here and shorten the amount of time that it takes to traverse that entire path. And there's this other kind of animation in here. You can see those particles moving around. Effects animation, that's another kind of animation you can do with 3D Studio. And I'm kind of able to have this high degree of interactivity because I took a couple of my objects here and chose to display them as a box. These are objects that are high poly count objects, and they would be getting in my way of doing all kinds of fancy stuff like this if I had them displayed. So see these red boxes here? Those little red boxes are actually bushes. And I've chosen to display them as a box because otherwise, as I said, I wouldn't be able to get the interactivity that I'm able to get right now, because they have a lot of polygons involved. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the box, which now represents a bush with leaves and everything, and I'm going to go to Edit. I'm going to go to Object Properties. And you can see under Object Properties there's a lot. Several tabs across the top applying to various aspects of rendering, advanced lighting, and mental ray. Those are something that we'll get into way later. You can change the name here. You can change the wireframe color here, just like you can here. But also what you can do is you can choose to hide it, but you can also have display properties here. The one that I'm using is display as box. So if I uncheck that, and there's a whole bunch of other properties here. These display properties, these apply to the 3D view only. So it won't render as a box. It will render as a bush. But in the viewport display, you can choose to display certain aspects of it. Vertex ticks, if you want to see the vertices all the time on it. You can show a trajectory if it has an animation hooked up to it. And then you have a separate rendering control. And that rendering control is where you would describe exactly to the renderer. Does it render at all? Does it cast or receive shadows? But for now, I'm going to turn off display as box. And then you'll see it shows in the viewport as this incredibly dense polygonal bush. And the same with this one. So I can go to object properties and turn off display as box as well. And now my viewport is going to start getting a little chunky, my viewport interactivity. And if I draw the other two not as a box, it'll be even worse. And 3D Studio has this thing. Click on one of these bushes here. And then when I right click over it, 3D Studio has this thing called a quad menu. Or right now it's kind of like a tri menu, but truthfully, honestly, it is a quad menu. But if you click over an object here, you can get some commands that you might frequently use to that object. So you'll see here there's a transform section, there's a display section, there's a tools 1, and there sometimes is a tools 2 section down here. And this will allow me to quickly go to move, rotate, scale, select similar tools. Also the clone tool I can get to really quickly here, but also in this case object properties. Now the object properties are going to come up without having to go to edit object properties. Well, that's fine, but what you can also do is you can right click. So if I just click right here in the title of it, I can pick whatever is blue. It's a quick shortcut to that last chosen command. But I can also choose to hide it. So I can hide selected. So I can take that and hide it. Now I can also pick this one, that bush there, and go out and then hide selection again, but I don't have to go all the way up there because it's blue. I can just click right here and it will do that operation that's listed in blue. You can also get to the show and hide tools by coming over here in the command panel. And here you have access to all of them. So you can hide by category. I can choose to hide all my lights, all my cameras, shapes. So if I want to hide that path that's kind of snaking through the alley and getting in my way quite a bit, I can hide shapes categorically. But I can also hide selected things. So I can pick things specifically and hide them. I can hide unselected things. So I could isolate things. I could hide by hit, which is a tool that then I can take and hide specific pieces of things or things that I click on. Now I can choose to unhide everything that I've hidden, or I can unhide by name, and it'll pop up a very similar dialog box to the select by name dialog. And then I can choose to take those things that I had hidden previously and unhide them. Now, if I pick multiple things and I go to Object Properties, either there or through the quad menu, it'll tell me I have multiple selected, and I can pick multiple things and affect their properties simultaneously. So if I want to choose those high density things and choose to display them as a box, I know they're there, they'll render, but they aren't going to get in my way of a nice speedy viewport here. So we just pull this up into QuickTime and hit play. What I've done is rendered out my series of frames with lighting, with textures, made a movie, got the animation on there, got the dust blowing in the wind, and path animation on the bag, modifier animation on it as well. Got that implied noise animation in the modifier of the noise modifier of the water, and got a little American Beauty moment going on here. Look at the bag, it's beautiful.